Now, as we know, floods have wrecked hundreds of homes and businesses and lives right across Yorkshire and Lincolnshire. Government ministers have pledged more concrete flood walls, but there's fast-growing support for more natural defences. Moorlands, which surround flood-hit areas like the Calder Valley, are failing to act like natural sponges, we are told, allowing water to rush into river systems. Now, environmental experts say we must act to slow the flow by restoring our spongy moorlands. Here's Liz Roberts.
These scenes of devastation have become a familiar sight. Everyone agrees something needs to be done. But what? According to one expert, a large part of the answer lies right on our doorstep. The UK is home to more than 10% of the world's peatland, and a large portion of that is here in the Peak District, along the Pennines and in the North York Moors. Problem is, 80% of our peatlands are damaged and don't do what they should.
This is the sphagnum. It holds a fantastic amount of water, 20 times its own weight. These are our natural, vast water holding sponges. These hold water back when there's heavy rain, and they release it gradually during times of drought.
How have they become ineffective?
We spent the last 500 years systematically destroying this habitat. We've polluted it from industry, and then we've drained it, we've grazed it, and then we've burnt it. And that has destroyed vast areas of the sphagnum. It's destroyed huge areas of peat bog, and that means that the water is no longer held in the uplands, and then it rushes downstream. So the whole of the natural flood control system is broken, and it needs to be repaired.
So what does government spending on natural flood management look like? In the current 6-year spending period, the government's provided grants totalling £654 million for flood defences across Yorkshire and Lincolnshire. Of that, £3.5 million is for projects solely for natural flood management. That's just over 0.5%. It means that a lot of projects rely on people like Bede Warren, a volunteer who's been building leaky dams above Hebden Bridge.
They're quite simple structures. They're simply tree trunks that have been felled in the forest and placed across the river to slow the flow. We've got measurements on several of these streams which indicate that by putting leaky dams across them, we're reducing the peak by about an hour in each of the rivers. Now, you can see each of these little streams is very small. So what we need to do is to expand this work on a catchment-wide basis.
The project here has the consent of the landowner, in this case the National Trust, but the owners and managers of our countryside are many and varied. The CLA, which represents farmers and landowners, says they should be encouraged to carry out flood maintenance on their land, but the funding needs to be sufficient and long-term.
That's something the government seems to be coming round to.
We need to make nature's power part of our solution alongside traditional engineered defences. We are already investing £10 million to restore our peatland habitats, planting enough trees to cover an area the size of East Anglia with a new £640 million Nature for Climate Fund, and supporting farmers to be part of our plans to prevent flooding through the new Environmental Land Management Scheme and to reduce and delay peak flows in our landscapes.
There's no suggestion that slowing the flow of water will provide all the answers, but there's hope that increasing the flow of funding for natural defences will make a real difference.
That was Liz Roberts reporting. They were also joined by Amanda Anderson from the Moorland Association. Her members are responsible for 1 million acres, no less, of moorland. We'll chat to Amanda in a moment. But Olivia Blake, let me just ask you, do we need to now look at more natural methods of flood protection?
Well, I think we absolutely do. And, you know, representing Sheffield Hallam, I do have a lot of peatland and moorland that it is being managed in a way which has meant significant burning. And I think that that's of a great concern to many of my constituents who don't really see why we're having scorched earth right on our doorstep at a time when we're calling for a climate emergency and action to stop not only the destruction of our natural environment, but also the protection from issues like flooding as well.
Amanda Anderson, why is this ground just not holding water. Is it being mismanaged?
The members in your constituency up on the moors there, they've clubbed together, actually. There's 4 estates that have worked really hard over the last 5 years. They've made up 4,500 leaky dams in the gullies there to help slow that flow. With bare peat, we definitely don't want, and that can be there for natural causes or previous wildfires or all sorts of reasons. Industrial pollution from the Industrial Revolution even. And 120 hectares, which is a very large amount of football pitches, have been revegetated. That will slow the flow again. And we're introducing the moss that you've seen on that piece there.
Well, stay with slowing the flow. Some groups, including anti-blood sports campaigners, are calling for a ban on the practice of heather burning for grouse shooting. Now, you can see here heather burning on moors in North Yorkshire. It's a practice used by grouse moors to engineer ideal game bird breeding habitats. Now, critics say decades of burning has devastated moorland and their capacity to soak up water. Does this need to be banned, Amanda Anderson, if it's having an impact on flood-hit communities?
I would say it should not be banned. We're using fire in the right places for the right reasons. So if you have a huge canopy of very dense vegetation and you're trying to open it up to the rain, to the weather, to allow those mosses to come back, then they need that light and they need to be able to have a chance. So there's restoration burning. There's also burning to mitigate from wildfire risks. It's quite hard to imagine that with all the rain we've had, the snow, the ice that we've got, but come the summer, wildfire will be back on the agenda. And in terms of reducing the fuel load for those fires to make devastating messes, really burning down into that peat and releasing that emissions is really what we need to also care about. So we need the right tool in the right place for the right reasons.
But do you honestly think that viewers at home will accept that just burning for grouse shooting is a worthwhile expense of all the biodiversity that is destroyed in this as well? And, you know, obviously this is about flooding, but there are wider implications of burning heather for grouse shooting, which I know anger a lot of people who want to see our biodiversity protected in our peaks, in the Peak District, and also want to make sure that their homes are protected from flooding. And I think, you know, there's a huge opportunity to, you know, make sure that we bring communities together around this issue and make sure that we see a reduction in the risk of flooding and an increase in the amount of water held in the uplands.
I think I agree with all of those things, that biodiversity is absolutely important. Climate emergency is important. As I've explained, our members are blocking up grips that the government incentivised back in the 1970s. You know, above these moors, thousands of kilometres. I think you could get to Cyprus from London with the amount of kilometres of these drainage ditches that have been blocked up to hold back that water, make it wetter, make the heather grow slower, so less management is actually required. But there needs to be a balance in this. Well,
just on that point, how do you explain what the RSBP's recent report on moorland protection it's pointed out that actually these fires are actually much more well used as a management tool than they were even 70 years ago. You know, I think that there's an increase in these fires, and that's what's really concerning. Even though we have actually got more restrictions on the time of year, we're seeing more and more of our moorlands being burnt. So how is that?
I think restrictions in burning have changed greatly recently, and also the focus on what that fire is to do. So it's not all about grouse, it's not all about heather. Nobody wants a monoculture of heather. We have species up there on the moors, the birds that they actually choose shorter vegetation, and that management of heather done the right way, alongside cutting as well. It's a new innovative tool that we're bringing in, so you don't see emissions from that as much, but there's still a tractor involved.
Can I bring in Sir Edward Lee? I mean, a lot of people have pointed out that less than 1% of government grants is spent on natural flood management. Now, in the light of the last few weeks, that needs to change, doesn't it?
That's a very good point. Actually, I've been talking to the Environment Agency today in Market Rasen, and it is undoubtedly true that there is not enough funding to help rural areas and to help farmers make floodplains, and too much of the funding goes to quite rightly protecting built-up areas. But in order to protect built-up areas, the new way of thinking is not just to build higher and higher walls or to stop the rain, we can't do that, But the new thinking is to try and use natural floodplains, compensating farmers, dredging rivers properly, which is a point I've made again and again. It's undoubtedly true that the Environment Agency has not been dredging and desilting rivers and dikes as much as they used to. It's a funding problem. So all these natural ways of dealing with flooding are the way forward, in my view.
So much to talk about with flooding, with no signs of the weather getting any better, but we must leave it there. Thank you all for your comments today. Well, that's